I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud, and this is Commotion. And look, I don't know if you're familiar with Norval Morrisseau's paintings, but usually in his work, he does these beautiful and really vibrant abstract depictions of people, animals, Anishnaabe legends, and spirituality. And you can see in his work why he's still one of the most celebrated Indigenous artists in the world. But for years, criminal fraudsters took advantage of that popularity, and they created fake Morrisseau paintings and made millions of dollars doing it. It is believed to be the largest art crime fraud in the world. Adrian Stimson explores all of this as the host of a brand new podcast called Forged from CBC and ABC Australia. He's an artist from Siksika Nation near Calgary, and that's where we reached him. Adrian, it's nice to have you on the show, friend.
Nice to see you, Elamin, and thank you for inviting me.
Yes, of course. Why don't we start by hearing you describe Morrisseau's art? What makes it such a special form of art?
Well, Norval Morrisseau, he introduced us, or Canadians in the world, to his amazing cultural history, Anishnaabe history, through his paintings. His use of color and line brought indigeneity into the contemporary art world and into the contemporary art mind. For instance, I have to sort of share two of my favorite paintings of his, Man Changing into Thunderbird, or Man Transforming into Thunderbird. This particular work hangs in the Art Gallery of Ontario, and it's 3 or 6 large panels. And it sort of chronicles the transformation of himself from man into Thunderbird, and the vibrant oranges, the animals, and then the slow sort of transformation, the sort of growing of a wing and many other things, right to the him actually becoming the Thunderbird, which is his namesake, Copper Thunderbird. And then he also has, I think, an earlier painting from 1958 on birch bark of the same subject. And it was just, for me, that sort of playful use of watercolor and pencil crayon on birch bark. And so I think, his work sort of brought that into our consciousness, and wonderfully so.
Adrian, let me ask you, you're an artist yourself. How much was Norval Morrisseau an influence for you personally?
He was a great influence. I think I remember seeing his work as a child, and it evoked wonder. And I think, and in many ways, perhaps ignited my artistic mind. But he was also at the vanguard of opening the doors for contemporary Indigenous art. He lived art. And he was a prolific painter. He wasn't afraid to experience the world, the good and the bad. And he brought, I think, the spirits to life, introduced us to the sort of healing nature of his work. And I think he approached me and my approach to art making. He taught us a lot about culture, like to share the culture as I like to do, his life, his being. And I think he's still teaching us in many ways. And I think this podcast is another lesson.
I was going to say, so this is a little bit where the story turns, right? Because it's one thing to sort of have a legendary artist. It's another thing to have that artist be, the target, let's say, of the largest art fraud in the world. Something you talk about in the podcast is how Morrisseau was maybe a target for these art fraudsters, not only because he was really popular, but maybe because his life also had some chaos in it, and that provided a perfect cover. Do you want to explain that concept a little bit? Because I'm really interested in that.
Yeah, sure. I believe his early trauma of abuses that occurred in Indian residential schools in Thunder Bay sort of set the stage, I think, for a lot of his life experiences, the dysfunction, the addiction. I think it really made it easy for predators to take advantage. And, I also, coming from the isolation of the North to the big city, it's a huge change and challenge, and, right into the art world, which in itself can be a challenge at times, a difficult place to navigate. But I think, those early experiences really sort of, played out in his life and did make him vulnerable in many ways. But, he also had agency too. I think in spite of it all, I think he was able to sort of traverse that and learn through that and move forward in his life.
Now, you take all of that life that is sort of reflected in that art, and it becomes, the largest amount of fakes that there are. There's so many fake Morrisseaus that, it's considered to be the largest art crime fraud in the world. Can you explain, just briefly, how vast and absolutely complicated this scale of this fraud is?
Well, I think as Kevin Hurd from the Bare Naked Ladies explained to me when we were interviewing, it's like a Blue Velvet and David Lynch sort of at the beginning when it sort of goes in and sort of into the ear and right into the minute details of the ear.
Yeah.
And so, it sort of never ends. And so I think, I think about that. And I think if you move through Norval's history of the frauds, more details are revealed. And then just when you thought you'd seen it or heard it all, something else comes forward. And I think being in the Indigenous art world, I have heard about the frauds, but really didn't know or understand the scale of it, the context, the complexities. It was amazing to research and interview the many people and who knew him and investigated the crimes and the multiple fraud rings and the abuses that took place in those fraud rings, and where and how the paintings were sold. It just feels like we scratched the surface, and it's a disturbing story on many levels.
I was going to say, like,
sure.
so you mentioned Kevin Hearn of the Bare Naked Ladies. Like, that's what kicked off this whole thing. Is that Kevin Hearn buys a Morrisseau, and then he learns that it's actually a suspected fraud. It's not a real one, and then it sort of like sends the whole story sort of like tumbling forward. You talked to people who knew Morrisseau, including his friend, the artist Joseph Sanchez, the last surviving member of the so-called Indigenous Group of Seven. Let's hear that clip.
You could see that in the beginning, he tried to be truthful to the legends. He's a storyteller. He says that he's probably one of the last people alive that knows what those symbols mean. He was so dedicated to the work itself that nothing, no matter what condition he was in, he could always create the work. And that's inspiring.
There's an urgency, I think. There's an urgency that you felt investigating the story, especially because you're trying to piece together a whole bunch of things that happened in Morrisseau's life in the 60s and 70s before people, who knew him would no longer be around. Tell me about sort of approaching that urgency.
Well, the reality of life is death. It's so important, it's so important to hear the stories from those who knew or met him. So many of those people have passed, and so the urgency to record and get those stories is ever present. Norval led an amazing life with so many stories, not only about the frauds, stories that can teach us so much about ourselves and about the times he lived in and the challenges he faced. I'm so grateful to the many people who shared their experiences and were in his presence. So, it's really so important to sort of record that history and tell those stories because, future generations need to know and understand, where they came from.
Yeah, of course. I think what may surprise people, is that Morrisseau was aware of the fraud. Like that to me is a really interesting dimension of the story. That when he was alive, he died almost 2 decades ago, but when he was alive, he tried to fight it. He wrote to art galleries. He would say, "Hey, I think you got a fake one in there. I think you have a fake one of my paintings in there." And he would tell them, "Hey, I didn't paint that." But he was unsuccessful in doing that. As an artist yourself, how do you feel when you hear what he went through in terms of trying to tell people I didn't do that work, and having him go unlistened to?
Yeah, well, it makes me both sad and mad.
Yeah, of course.
Sad in the sense that, first of all, people took advantage of him and then ignored his pleas. Of course, those people had something to lose, which added and made it, complicit by ignoring him. Mad in that it reveals the underbelly of the art world, those who decided to take advantage of him, the racism, the privilege of being able to ignore and malign him. I think that those things are things that come forward as we researched, but it's also so true for many Indigenous folks and artists in Canada through history. So I think it is a telling story of the not the complexities but the realities that artists, in particular Indigenous artists, face.
Adrian, I didn't want to end this conversation without, I think, reflecting on something that to me is pretty significant here, which is like there is a tragedy. There's a tragedy at the core of all of this. Of Morrisseau's popularity is so vast that there are so many people profiting off of it, and it's the thing that lets so many fraudsters kind of take advantage. What do you hope people take away from listening to the podcast? Because there's something about sort of bridging the gap between learning about Morrisseau's life as an artist and the things that he went through, and then also how vast the fraud is around so many fake Morrisseau paintings. And you're trying to say, this isn't right. The gap between these two things isn't right. Tell me what you hope people take away from the podcast.
Well, first and foremost in the podcast, we deal with the facts and the context of his life
Yeah.
and the fraudsters. I think as Gerald McMaster stated, it's a cautionary tale, for artists and collectors, for all of us, to be aware of the nefarious forces that are out there. Be prepared, to understand the complexities, and as well, to understand the complexities and context of his life, that he was a human being like all of us. He had his faults, yet what an amazing life he led. He gave us so much, and I think in so many ways he continues to do so. And his legacy in many ways can transform us and continue to give us lessons in being not only as artists, but as human beings.
You mentioned Gerald McMaster, curator of the AGO, yes?
At the time, yes, he was curator at the AGO, and noticed Kevin Hearn's painting. He thought there was problems with it, and that's when he sort of brought it to light.
But I appreciate about this is a sort of a continuing legacy of trying to say, like, we're going to set Norval Morrisseau's story correct. Maybe you didn't get a chance to do that in his lifetime. This podcast is an attempt to do that. How has your view of Norval Morrisseau's life and work kind of changed as you embarked on this podcast?
Well, just the sort of vast sort of diversity of it. He not only was a painter, he's a performance artist. He made objects, many different sort of things. So I think the interdisciplinary nature of his life. I think it just really also says that in spite of the challenges, in spite of these frauds, at the core is his art. And there are many original Morrisseaus out there, and to be able to encounter those in our time and into the future is very special. And I think it's something that, has become part of the fabric of, the Canadian sort of zeitgeist in many ways. And I think that, I think it's just, he also spoke to the nature, the healing nature of his work and the use of colors and part of that healing. And as we know, through, many psychological studies and stuff like that, that's the truth, that color does heal. And I think that, in continuing to look at those paintings, he heals us, and I think I take solace in that, and I think that that's a big part of his legacy that will continue to live on in spite of it all.
Adrian, I really appreciate you coming on the show today. Thank you so much for your time, friend.
Oh, really great. Thank you. Really great to be with you today.
Yes, of course. Adrian Stimson is an artist from the Siksika Nation, and he's a host of the new podcast Forged about the art crime underworld of fake Norval Morrisseau paintings. It is a co-production by CBC and the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. Episode 1 is out now wherever you get your podcasts. In the meantime, my name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This show is called Commotion. Have a great day. We'll see you tomorrow.